3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Renaissance Men podcast. I am Michael Parilla.
And I am Vishal Shah.
And today, we are actually going to be talking about transgenderism and transgender issues. So there are a lot of things to discuss here. Vishal, where would you like to start with this?
Well, so I want to point out part of the reason that we chose this topic specifically was regarding a recent case. So, a boy by the name James Younger. And there's a few details revolving this case that are telling of the direction that things are heading.
Yeah.
But also where support is highest for the trans community and where it's lacking. So I'll begin just by reading off some of these facts here. And this is just from Daily Mail. A judge ruled that a father who is fighting to stop his 7-year-old son from transitioning to a girl will be allowed to have a say in future medical decisions related to the child. Now, so that having been said, there's going to be, it's contingent that there are joint agreements between both parents. Now, that would include haircuts, dental things, psychiatric care. They have to be agreed on most things regarding their child. Furthermore, sole managing guardianship of the boy and his twin brother have been granted to the mother, who is highly in support of the boy transitioning, and some would say is even going so far as to encourage him and pressure him. So videos have surfaced, for example, showing the boy, to put it bluntly, behaving like a boy and saying that his mother encourages him to do otherwise.
Yeah, and one of the things that the father has claimed is that when the boy is with his father, that he acts more like a boy, and when he's with the mother, that he acts more like a girl. And so one of the things that this may indicate is that the boy might simply just be trying to please his parents. Right. It isn't necessarily an indication that he is one way or the other, but the mother is pushing. She is the one who has been pushing for transgender hormone treatment rather.
Right, and so there are very stark long-term consequences for doing such. I mean, for one, you can prevent many of these stages of puberty at that age. The boy is 7 years old, so this could have huge consequences for his future, and
potentially irreversible consequences as well.
Right. I mean,
infertility being one of them.
So there's a list of concerns here as far as the long term. In fact, the idea that parents should even be able to decide such a thing like this for their child has even come into question, because there seems to be a debate as to whether or not the transitioning of this child should be even in parents' purview. So should the child be required to wait until he's 18 years old, adult, to be able to decide that? Or, and as some people are saying, and some activists are saying on the trans side of things, that doing such would be transphobic, and that doing such would make it so that the boy would have to go through puberty and would have to live the next 11 years of his life as a boy. So there's a little bit of disagreement here.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the issues there is that this kid is only 7. And so I think he's just far too young to be able to even understand his own identity fully and make a decision like this. And so if he makes a decision, if they make a decision to do something that is irreversible to him at this age, it's entirely possible that he may come to regret it later and realize that, he is a boy, or maybe he realizes he's a girl later in life and wants to transition then. And in which case there really isn't much loss there, as opposed to the alternative case in which he could completely lose his ability to have children in the future, which may be a far more distressing effect than he would experience otherwise.
Right, and we'd mentioned that there's going to be long-term consequences to such a choice. It's one of those situations where if James, like you said, decides that, by the time he's 18, that he wants to be a girl and that everything that his mother specifically would have done to that point would have been fine, then great. I suppose you could assume that there's no harm because there's no loss, right? So that having been said, if the boy decides that that's not the case, that he's resentful about the choice that his parents have made for him, then we're going into a huge human rights violation and an entire dynamic that follows through past that. So some additional things here, and I wanted to specifically talk about some of the trans activists. And part of the reason why is because this case specifically has riled a vast amount of support from public trans activists, people who self-proclaim that they are representing a trans community. They haven't been elected to do so or anything like that. And so that's truly a self-assigned definition, as many of these other things are. So that having been said, are they addressing trans issues properly? Are there more pressing issues that they should be looking at? And is this worth the time? So some statistics from GLAAD. Trans people are 4 times more likely to live in poverty. This is all from GLAAD, so I want to point that out. There's the possibility that there's a
bias in favor of the LGBT community.
Right. And so take that for what you will. But the statistics are what the trans community trusts. And so if statistics are pointing out a certain thing, you would imagine or assume that trans activists are going to respond accordingly and see statistics from GLAAD as a good reason to pursue something as an issue. So, like I said, 4 times more likely to live in poverty. 90% of trans people report experiencing harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. 53% of transgender people report being harassed or disrespected in a place of public occupation, for example, a bathroom. So, complicated issues, right? We've talked about various harassment issues among ourselves and the various solutions to such things and the difficulty to find solutions. These are things that are difficult to solve, right? Especially when it comes to things like mistreatment and discrimination in the workplace. There's an entire dynamic there that needs to be addressed, but it is incredibly difficult to say that one person, for example, was fired because they're trans and not because of quality of other factors of their work.
That's the difficulty in addressing a issue like this, is that in order to file a case for discriminatory practices in the workplace, you actually have to be able to prove that your employer was either that they fired you or they were treating you a certain way because of these immutable characteristics. For example, your race or your sexuality, your gender, whatever that may be. Because if you're unable to prove it, then it's inadmissible in a court of law. Right? We have a law system in which you're innocent until proven guilty, and so collecting that evidence is also it can be tricky. Right, you either have to have some either written or videotaped evidence of your employer expressing some sort of discriminatory view, and gaining that kind of evidence, not always going to be easy. There are some cases in which someone, an employer might send out an email expressing, sentiments against a certain community, and you might be able to use that. But short of something like that, you really might not have a case.
Yeah, even simply saying that, of course, there's always been the he said, she said dynamic. So sometimes somebody could say something harassing or disrespectful. There might not be any viable way of keeping an account for that. But so I'll continue. HumanRightsCommission.org shows harrowing statistics from a study recently published by the American Academy of Pediatrics, revealing an alarming level of attempts for suicide among transgender youths, with the highest rates amongst transgender boys and non-binary youth. The findings emphasize the urgency of building welcoming and safe communities for the LGBTQ community, specifically youth and particularly transgender youth. Moreover, more than half of transgender male teens who participate in the survey reported attempting suicide in their lifetimes. Meanwhile, 29.9% of transgender female teens said they had attempted suicide. And among non-binary youth, 41.8% of respondents stated that they had attempted suicide at some point in their lives. So, as though we didn't know this before, there is a very pressing issue of mental health and specifically suicidality among the trans community. And that's something that I think should absolutely be addressed, and that's something we should be concerned about. We should be trying to prevent people from harming themselves. However, and with any endeavor that you go for, effort you put into one place is perhaps more valuable somewhere else. You have to negotiate where your resources need to be placed.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring up these statistics, like I said, there are very pressing issues we're looking at, and yet the most common talking points regarding transgender people are things like Desmond is great, for example, or
Desmond is amazing.
Sorry, Desmond is amazing. And
don't downplay Desmond.
I wasn't much of a fan, but yeah, I mean, it's just not my cup of tea.
But I think I understand what you're saying, though. There's a lot of focus from transgender activists and GLAAD also in order to reach younger and younger children to, let's say, educate them on LGBTQ history, issues, a variety of things, but also to expose them to a lot of these concepts. And, there are a variety of reasons why they might want to do this. One is to promote openness for the LGBT community. But it isn't necessarily going to result in a lot of the changes that I think they want. It isn't necessarily going to prevent suicidality among transgender people. When you look at suicide amongst transgender people, it isn't always going to be easy to determine what the causes are. I think that it is. I think it's reasonable to assume that a lot of the reason why they may commit suicide, or why anyone would commit suicide, is because they have some feeling of hopelessness. And so if you're going to address the issue of suicide, you need to figure out what the root of that hopelessness is. Is it hopelessness that they will be accepted? Is it hopelessness that they might not be able to understand or become comfortable with themselves? Because, fundamentally at the root of transgenderism is an uncomfortability with your own body, or with your
gender dysphoria. Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And so, right off the bat, they have a lot of existential issues that they need to work out. And,
they as individuals.
Yes. Right? And it's not always going to be, I don't think this is an issue that's going to be solved by any simple solution. Because it very much is something that needs to be addressed at the individual level. I don't think that there is necessarily any law that you can pass that's going to stop suicide. Although, there are certainly some legal areas in which there could be a little bit more fairness given to LGBT people. But again, it's not so simple. I mean, one example, the bathroom issue.
Incredibly complex.
Yeah, with transgender people not being allowed to use certain bathrooms. I believe certain states have passed laws saying that if you need to use the bathroom with which your biological sex it correlates with, and something like that is, it's tricky because, number one, I don't actually think that the government should be legislating what bathrooms people aren't allowed to use. Especially, in the context of, let's say, you using the bathroom at a public facility, because obviously you're gonna be allowed to use the bathroom in your own home. That's not a thing.
Right.
This really only applies to public restrooms. I think that fundamentally, when it comes to private businesses, it should be left up to the discretion of the owner of the business as to what kind of bathroom policy they're going to implement, if they implement any at all.
Right. I want to point out that there are various nuances even to that statement, right? So, one of those things is that we can look at, and we have slightly differing viewpoints on this, but it is incredibly important to point out those differences, because it kind of shows how vast this issue really is, and how complicated a solution is. So, for one, we can look at the civil rights movement, specifically for black people in this country, and see how certain areas were segregated. And that was by law. It's not that businesses necessarily chose to. I'm sure that some preferred to, but it was by law that people had to be segregated. Now, you take something like that away and make it so that people have to be allowed in any space. You can't. It's not like a business can say, well, you're a specific color, so you're not allowed into this business. There's argument to be made, I suppose. And I don't have all the answers, right? But I would imagine that the trans activists are looking for them, which they don't seem to be. That this is a complex issue. How do you fix something like if a business has 2 bathrooms, for example, and someone who is transgender wants to use one of them, should they be given a 3rd bathroom? Should every place with 2 bathrooms that are gender assigned, should all those companies, all those places have to build a 3rd bathroom? Should that be something that the law implements? Many would argue no.
I think that issue in particular is, I think it's the morally easy answer, but the logistically difficult one.
Yes, and then so we can look at the morally tricky issue, but logistically easy one, I suppose, and flip the scale a little bit. You can say, well, all right, well, transgender people are allowed to use any bathroom that they choose. If a transgender person goes, regardless, they're able to use either bathroom, but there's some clear issues with that as well. Where do you draw the line and say one person is transgender and another person isn't? And where do you draw the line to say one person has legitimate reasons to be using a bathroom that somebody might not have expected them to go into, and then someone who is malicious and just wants to go into the opposite sex's bathroom and has, like I said, malicious reasons to do so? Where do you draw that line? How do you determine that? Do you have again, logistically difficult issues if you look at them from the moral standpoint, and morally difficult issues if you look at them from the logistical standpoint. So these are things that the trans community, and specifically trans activists that, like I said, have not been elected but claim that they are acting in the interests of trans people, you would think that this is something that they'd be in the lab about, so to speak, figuring out solutions for, right? Because who else is going to do it? But they aren't. They're focusing attention to things like Desmond is amazing, and this 7-year-old would-be transgender child. And
they've been making concerted pushes to try and make it acceptable for young children to go through gender reassignment surgeries or receive hormone treatments, which is, frankly, I think, doing a disservice to the LGBT community itself, because it makes a lot of concerned parents a lot more distrusting of these movements. And according to GLAAD's own statistics, over the past 2 years, acceptance for a lot of transgender and LGBT people has actually dropped significantly, including in the demographic of 18 to 34-year-olds, who are likely the most accepting of LGBT people, and yet amongst them, acceptance has dropped by 20%.
So we have the statistics pulled up here, so we're going to read them off to you.
Yeah, so in 2016, acceptance amongst 18 to 34-year-olds was at approximately 63%, and now in 2019, it is Actually, excuse me, 27. Yeah, now in 20, I think the most recent year is 2018 that they have statistics for. It's now at 45%, and so that's a roughly 20% difference. But the real key difference, I think, is when you break it down by gender. So amongst females, it's dropped by about 10%, whereas amongst males, it's dropped by about 30%. In fact, it basically got cut in half.
Went from 62 to 35 to be specific, and that's in the span of 2 years.
Yes. And I think a lot of this has to do with people becoming more uncomfortable with their children being exposed to a lot of these LGBT concepts, but also I think that wouldn't necessarily be the catalyst for these drop-offs if it weren't for the overly sexualized nature of the way that these concepts are being presented.
Right. I mean, Pride is a fantastic example of that. I've been to 3, and they were incredibly I mean, I saw children who saw pretty much naked people.
Yeah.
Or at the very least saw parts of their body that they probably should not have been exposed to. And in a very sexualized manner.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and a lot of this makes people uncomfortable because of, they fear pedophiles and pedophilia, and especially, you talk about a kid like Desmond is amazing. There are videos of him dancing,
stripping,
basically stripping and having money thrown at him by grown men. Meanwhile, he's a child.
Yep.
And this is something that supposed trans activists are promoting, and yet is it any wonder why people are becoming more uncomfortable with these issues, because they now see them as a potential gateway to pedophilia. And not saying that it necessarily is, but pedophiles are actively trying to insert themselves into the movement as well. They've tried to create a pedophile acceptance movement. And so when you see things like that, like Desmond is amazing, having money thrown at him while he's dancing, it's not a good look.
Yeah, I mean, you can watch the video, and I believe he has an undershirt on. He takes off a shirt, swings it around, and has people throwing money at him. In fact, he owns his own drag house, mm-hmm. actually. So, I suppose I don't know if I really need to say much more than that. A line has been crossed, right? And it's not something that is just going to affect people who, dress in drag, or just trans people. What I fear and what I'm concerned about is that the baby will be thrown out with the bathwater, and that the parts of, for example, LGBTQ history that should be in the books, that we probably should be teaching people, might get thrown out and undermined because of the spectacle made by many of these people. And so it's a serious concern. I mean, the whole reason that Pride matters. And by the way, I'm bisexual, right? I've not only have been to Pride, but I've literally participated in it, and been to the after parties and things like that. So it's all supposed to be about the fact that at some point in our past, it was a heinous thing to be part of that community. People would shun you. You could get fired for it.
It was
arrested
illegal.
For it. You could be it was illegal. You could be put into a sexual therapy type thing where people, I don't remember the exact name, but they would essentially try to
conversion camps.
Yes, conversion therapy, right? So there's serious oppression in the past, and we don't have that nearly to the extent that we did. It's a small fraction of that
in this country.
Not in many other countries, but in the United States, thankfully, the home of freedom. And now you go to a pride parade, and it's incredibly, incredibly sexualized.
Yeah.
And not that people shouldn't be able to do whatever they do in the privacy of their bedrooms. That was the whole movement, was the fact that people should be able to do what they want to do in the privacy of their bedrooms and not have police break into their homes and
Yes.
into their bedrooms, and a lot of those values have been lost. The actual value for pride was freedom, individual liberty. And now people see pride, and it's something they don't want to bring their kids to.
Yeah, because they see it as hedonistic.
Absolutely.
And that does a lot more to negate the progress that this movement has made. It makes people a lot less accepting than more accepting, which is supposed to be the goal of these things.
I mean, just one thing, for example, how do you think that affects same-sex parents, And how do you think that affects people's perception of those parents?
Yeah.
These are people who, most members of this community, and we can go into the fact that it's not really much of a one unified community either, but members of this community are largely trying to just live peaceful and happy lives. Go to school, get a job, earn some money, get a house. Essentially the American dream, right? To be able to take the opportunities that are around us and use them to get to somewhere better than where you are. And we've talked about some very serious issues regarding discrimination in the workplace, suicidality. These are things that we could actually be addressing. I want to continue with some of these statistics here, and one that's incredibly striking. So, non-LGBTQ people between the age of 18 and 34, and this is by GLAAD, of course. The statistic is to show how many of them were uncomfortable in personal situations, specifically learning, and quote, learning my child had a lesson on LGBTQ history in their schools. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, the concern for this has went from 27% in 2016 to 39% by 2018. And just to give some reference here, in 2017, we only saw a 3% increase. Went from 27 to 30. Still not necessarily a good thing.
But a much smaller increase.
Right, much smaller increase. And in fact, if we're looking at that by comparison to other demographics, that's actually largely in line with what we would expect. I mean, here we have this with just generally speaking, non-LGBTQ Americans being uncomfortable in the same situations went from 34% in 2016 to 37% in 2017, same 3% increase.
So that 3% increase applies to both the 18 to 34 demographic as well as the general demographic, including all ages.
And that 9% jump from 2017 to 2018 is incredibly relevant statistically.
A 9% jump amongst the 18 to 34 demographic, which is likely the most accepting demographic of the LGBT community.
Likely grown up around the most people who were openly identified within one of those categories.
Yes, and now that their uncomfortability with that is at 39%, it is actually equal to the general demographic, which is also at 39% now.
And so if you thought that, for example, and some people have the perception, or perspective rather, that, baby boomers and people who are of the older generation aren't accepting of these ideas. And we're seeing the exact same levels of acceptance towards that idea, specifically LGBTQ history, being taught in schools, as we are with 18 to 34-year-olds. This should be incredibly alarming, especially if you think that we're making progress. And like I mentioned before, the largest concern is that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, that the things that should be taught in the history classes don't get taught because of the perception of over-sexualized nature and hedonism that is often portrayed by some members of the LGBT community.
Yes.
And one of my big reasons that my ideas on pride have changed,
Well, I definitely think that the way that it's being presented is counterproductive to the movement.
Yeah.
And that being said, though, I should also mention that despite these increases in uncomfortability with the LGBT movement and with these lessons being taught to children, acceptance for or belief in equal rights for LGBT people has remained pretty stable at roughly 80% of all people believing that they deserve equal rights.
Right.
And
that's within the past 3 years.
And so the percentage of people who believe that they deserve equal rights hasn't changed at all, but the uncomfortability has increased. And so it's very telling that the causes of this are generally regarding the perception that people have about what these movements are doing, specifically to children. And again, exposing children to LGBT concepts wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing were they not over-sexualized. And,
yeah,
I think that on another, tackling this from another direction, if we're going to compare something like heterosexuality and homosexuality, these things are fundamentally rooted in their sexuality. I mean, it's what they are. It's about your sexual attraction, but it's also about the relationships that you build with people. And so there isn't a need for it to be overly sexualized. There isn't a need for these pride parades or for any of these exhibitionist movements to be as sexual as they are if the goal is to promote acceptance of lifestyles. If the goal is to promote acceptance of certain relationships, right? You have the freedom to be in a relationship with whoever you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to engage in promiscuity or in public acts of nudity, especially when it comes to children. Exposing those kinds of things to children at very young ages can have negative consequences.
Yeah, I mean, one way or another, you're going to find that a majority of people hold values that are counter to that are counter to their children being exposed to nudity. That's the majority. And so one way or another, we're going to see negative repercussions for that. Now, I want to point out, like I said, the Pride Parade had good roots, right? It's great to be proud of the fact that you're able to, or rather I should say that we're able to live our lives. That was the goal, was to be able to live normal lives, get normal jobs, be able to do it all, right? And quite frankly, no one was asking for special advantages. We just wanted, for example, gay to not be an insult. We want, very simple things. And the over-sexualization of this, the people who think that the LGBT community is already a group, the people that already have this idea that these people are a hypersexualized group, that idea is totally reinforced and justified by saying something like that.
Yes.
And so...
and unfortunately, I think it also promotes people to engage in stereotypes. Not just to stereotype people, but also people lean into the stereotypes of themselves. And all that does is... like you said, reinforce the ideas that people who aren't accepting of these things already have about them, and make them even more assured in their lack of acceptance, in their opposition. Right. Because now all they have to do is point and say, "Look, see, I was right about all the things I was saying. Look at this hypersexualization. Look at these naked people, dancing around children. Look at them throwing money at this little kid who's basically stripping. Look at them trying to give hormone therapy to children who aren't even old enough to understand the concept of gender." When you do things like this, you make it much harder for the average person in the LGBT community who just wants to live their life and be left alone. The average person who doesn't engage in any of these behaviors.
Yeah, is just trying to live their lives and not be judged for it. And quite frankly, things like that give a lot of ammunition to people who are looking to judge. And I want to point out something else as well. And it's that the approach to this doesn't need to just be a moral one. It's a tactical one as well. We're looking for a solution, right? This isn't just about moral grandstanding. This isn't just about saying we're here and that's that, right? We still have objectives, specifically one of the things that I'd mentioned prior was suicidality, and fixing that is a serious objective that we could be putting that effort towards, and we can be raising that as the highest need issue in this, rather than simply boasting that we're free, right? I mean, like I said, that was never the point to begin with.
Yeah.
I want to
one thing though, in regards to suicidality, I think that there are a lot of trans activists, and I've seen a lot of them argue that getting children to transition earlier would be one way to potentially prevent suicide, because you could maybe get them to, not necessarily have to go through puberty as one sex. Maybe that makes them, more accepting of themselves. But the statistics just don't bear that out. And in fact, the suicide rates for transgender people after they transition are much higher than they are before they transition.
Yeah.
So they propose a lot of solutions that are either unproven or simply disproven. And I think that, unfortunately, this has a lot to do more with ideology than it does with wanting to actually solve the problem.
And in many ways, that's kind of, if I had to put it all into one sentence, I think it would be that the thesis of my statement is that trans activists do not care about or represent trans people in nearly the way that is, perceived or claimed to be done. I mean, I don't think that trans activists are doing things, at least many. I'm sure that we've all heard the idea that if there's 10 people in a room and 9 of them are saying something quietly amongst themselves and one person is loud, then of course it looks like everyone in that group believes a certain thing. The loudest voice is the one that's going to be heard. And so in many ways we see that happen with the trans activists. The loudest voices seem to be the ones that, like you said, are pushing for earlier gender reassignment, earlier hormone therapies. Meanwhile, the 9 other reasonable voices in the group are focused on the issues that seem to directly affect them every day. Discrimination at the workplace, I think, should be at the forefront, as well as suicidality, of course, because you need to be alive before you can have a job, right? I think mental health is the most important part of that. Mental health is an enormous issue in the United States in general.
Yeah, and there could be a variety of reasons for why that is. And so, these issues are very difficult to solve. I don't think that you could necessarily point to any one thing and say that that is the cause of the high suicide rates, not just amongst transgender people, but amongst people in general. And I think that this has a lot more to do with the place that we as a society find ourselves in morally, in terms of what we feel our purpose is. Because again, a lot of people feel purposeless and hopeless. And that is probably one of the biggest reasons why anyone would commit suicide, because they feel that there is nothing for them in the world. And that's not an easy problem to solve. It's something that I think requires a concerted effort from a conscientious society in order to solve.
Yeah.
Not something that you can pass a law and fix.
Right. You're not going to pass a law and end suicide or many of these issues that we have. And that kind of brings me to kind of a lighter topic, which is what can you do to help fix the issue, right? Because, like you said, this isn't something where it's a top-down issue where the government is going to be able to fix this. This needs to be addressed by individuals, and individuals need to be bettering their mental health, but also that if you see somebody who seems to be struggling with depression or other things, that should take alarm to you, and not necessarily just because that person is trans, but if they are, keep that in mind, that they might be dealing with certain issues that others won't, and that you can help alleviate in small ways. Very small things that you can do that go such a long way. Listening to somebody's story about how they got there, or discrimination that they faced, for example, just knowing other people want to listen and actually care about those things. Um, there's always this perception that if trans people are to be able to live happily in our society, that we need to take multiple steps back, in a way, right? This is kind of the larger narrative, is that trans people will do what they do, and in a lot of ways we almost shouldn't be involved in fixing the issue.
That isolationism is probably one of the big contributing factors into suicide. Again, not just of transgender people, but of everyone.
Yeah.
I think that people are increasingly becoming isolated from one another, and probably one of the biggest factors in preventing suicide will be giving people a sense of community, a more tightly knit group of people that you surround yourselves with. And this goes into friends, but it's also about your neighbors too. Just the people that you interact with on a daily basis. I feel that as a society, we've become more and more disconnected from a lot of these people, and it makes us feel alone.
Yeah, and the idea of community that I'd mentioned, the idea that the LGBT community and its various other letters that I can't remember all of right now and probably will never be able to memorize because there's way too many. It's not one community. It's not one unified group that thinks all of the same stuff. No one person represents all of them. And I would even go so far as to say no one person represents any one of those specific groups within that.
Because each group is made up of individuals.
And
individuals have varying desires and perspectives.
And that furthermore, if you want to talk about community, talk about your neighbors, talk about the people you interact with. So that's how you help the LGBT community. You see people within your own community and you treat them fairly. And look, I mean, I'm sure there are many people out there who have had it worse than me, but I've been in some, as someone who's bisexual, I've been in some situations where I felt like I was greatly discriminated against or hated, and I can't tell you how much it hurts to know that not one person is looking at you with some semblance of respect or cares about the fact that you're being disrespected. So the one thing that everybody within the entire umbrella of that community can ask for, and I can guarantee they're asking for it, is to be treated fairly. And that's it. Treat people fairly. That's all. That's what the entire community has fought for so long. That's what many communities have fought for so long. And quite frankly, it's not like anyone is asking for more than that. It's something you can do very easily.
Yeah.
The average person within their own community can carry out that.
And in regards to this, as advice to people who are part of these communities, who are trying to navigate these situations, I think the best thing that you can do, if someone is approaching you with hostility or a semblance of hostility, is to not respond in kind, because that's actually only going to make it worse, especially if there are people around watching. You always want to be able to take the higher ground morally. And so if someone is coming at you with hostility, the best thing to do is to try and show them kindness, and perhaps you soften them. Maybe they stop showing you hostility. Maybe not. Maybe they continue. But the people around you will see who the real bad guy in that situation is.
Yeah, I mean, if you like, I can give one example from my own life. I've worn much more flamboyant clothing in the past, and I've been in work environments and various other situations where I was taunted for it and ridiculed for it, belittled. And rather than swinging back, I took it with a smile. Very odd approach to many people. Most, especially people within our generation, have this mentality that if somebody opposes them, like you said, that they should just swing back and oppose back. But what ended up happening over time, and whether that was a work environment or another, I did the best I could do, regardless of what it was. If I was at somebody's house, and I'd be as helpful as I could be, clean things up and be respectful to each person in the household and do as much as I could in that regard. And if I was in a workplace, I did the best job I could do because I realized that I was representing more than myself in a lot of ways. And would you believe what happened? I gained their respect. I took somebody who many people would call bigoted, and I turned them into very accepting people, right? Or they turned into very accepting people because I gave them the opportunity to respect me rather than attacking them and essentially being exactly what they thought I was, someone who couldn't take the heat. I showed that I was someone worth respecting, and they respected me for it, and hopefully they respected the next person they saw in a similar situation. And just maybe by taking the tactical high ground instead of just morally grandstanding, I was able to not only help myself, but hopefully I've helped other people who might have been belittled and ridiculed by those same exact people that did that to me.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of Daryl Davis. A man who,
exactly
a black man who befriended many KKK members, neo-Nazis, and got them to renounce and leave the Klan to step away from their bigoted beliefs because they were able to see that their perceptions of what black people were wrong because they befriended him. And had he approached them with hostility, as they approached him with hostility, that would have never happened. It always feels cathartic to lash out at the people that you perceive as your enemies. But if you do that, all you get is conflict. All you get is the fight, and the fight will never end. If you want the fight to end, you actually have to be willing to an extent tolerate some of the hostility that you'll receive in an effort to show people that you are not what they think you are.
Yeah, you can't win the game if you don't play the game. If, for example, women were discriminated in the government, and so anytime a woman thought to go into the government, she said no because I'm going to be discriminated against, forget that, we'd have no women in government. The same thing can be said about any demographic that could have been discriminated against in any field. You have to, if you see discrimination in the world, that's your opportunity to do something good, right? That's your opportunity to create real change. And the takeaway of this, hopefully, should be that there is an immense room for real change that individuals, everyday folk can do. And you don't have to do it. You don't have to change a whole organization or an entire group. You change individuals. And that's a community, a group of individuals. That's how you better a community. It feels like it's a good place to leave off there. And that having been said, thank you for sticking around. And we'd love to hear feedback from you, of course. So please subscribe if you liked what we've posted. And, of course, hit the notification bell so you can know when we're going to be doing more work. And comment, let us know what you're thinking. Ask us your questions because we'll be happy to answer.
Absolutely. And I am Michael Perilla.
I am Vishal Shah, and thank you for joining us today, the Renaissance Men Podcast.
Signing out.
Have a great night.